Contrast? Yes, contrast, like we just spoken about. Um, so what do I mean by contrast, right? It basically means it at its simplest application, just having one thing drastically different in comparison to another, right? It doesn't necessarily always mean the exact opposite, but just different. You know what I mean? Different enough to provide contrast. And so one of the biggest ingredients in getting to feel good in your animation is getting good contrast, right? Contrast can manifest itself in a couple of different ways, but the ones that I've found to be the most effective in contributing to like getting a really good feeling, that juiciness that I was talking about, right? It's good contrast and timing, right? Um, a contrast in timing can represent a number of things, right? How fast the character is, how old the character is, how heavy or light the character is. Uh, but it's when it's being used for contrast, you normally want to use it for punchiness or impact. You know what I mean? And you normally want to save that part. Spacing is like a contrast in timing, and spacing is really huge, and it's a really great way of differentiating characters, differentiating moments, differentiating emotions, head spaces, state of mind, all that good stuff. And then this is an important one, and it's very much like I think I may have mentioned to you guys before, right? Like knowing how to use the principles are just as important as knowing them, right? And so there should be contrast in like the major choices that we make when we're choosing a number of things, like the timing of things, the spacing of things, so on and so forth. But we don't want the same amount of contrast in every single decision we make. You know what I'm saying? Ideally, you'd save your biggest amount of contrast for like the biggest accent in your animation. And I have examples of that in a little bit. And actually, this one is actually one that not a lot of people think about: contrast and absence. So, another way to get contrast that's not very, that's not thought of, like I was saying, is using absence. And what I mean by that is like, it's using the absence of something versus the presence of something. You can't get further apart contrast than that, right? It's there, it's not there. You know what I mean? That is the most amount of contrast that you can possibly get. Most of the time, it's not necessarily a choice that we can make as animators, but when you're allowed to use it or when you can use it wisely. And then so I have examples, but I have a sync sketch link that I do want us to go over, and not just talk about contrast, but like just like the scene as a whole. And we'll break that down later, actually, because I do love like the times that we get to look at animation together and kind of talk about it. Okay, so this is kind of what I mean. So contrast and timing. So as you can see, right, like these lines you can think of as timelines, right? And so the movement that like things take, like fast versus slow, excuse me, few frames versus many frames, or when things happen, like a contrast in the timing, like when things hit, along your timeline. A contrast in spacing, right? And this goes back to the principle of normal spacing, right? We are slowing into this movement and we are slowing out of this movement. We are fasting into this movement and we are fasting out of this movement, or fasting into this movement and then fasting out of that movement, and the variations that happen within those two, right? It could be any varying degree of those. So this is what I meant about contrast and context. So let's say, for example, that each of these letters represent poses that you're going to hit, right? Your character goes from pose A to pose B, pose C to pose D, pose E to pose F, so on and so forth, right? And so if we were to kind of measure the amount of contrast that you're getting between the two poses, A to B, right, you'd get this much contrast. C to D, you would get this much contrast. E to F, G to H, so on and so forth. But you can see that between all of these poses, you're pretty much getting the same amount of contrast, right? That is not what we want. We want to save the biggest amount of contrast for the moment that we choose, right? The accent that we build up to in our shot and the accent we build down from in our shot or in our animation, right? Whatever it is that we're animating. And you can see, oh, sure.
Sorry, I just wanted, is this kind of, am I correct in saying it's sort of like, what is it? Like if you dial everything up to 11, like nothing stands out
Yes.
sort of thing. Right?
Yep, absolutely. If everyone's super, no one will be, right? And so that's not what we want. And yes, you are absolutely right. But with our chosen moment of this E to F being like the moment at which we dial it up to 11, we can see that even outside of that, right? There are varying degrees of contrast because as that saying went, right? If you have the same amount of contrast from every change, then it's not going to feel like anything. You know what I mean? It's just going to feel really even keel. It's going to feel like it's missing something, you know? Here we go. So this is the most obvious one that I can probably represent. Contrast and absence, right? Pose A to B, it's not there. Pose C to D, it's not there. Pose E to F, it's not there. Pose G to H, it's cranked up to 11. And then the rest of the poses, it's not there again. So, as a small exercise or a little bit of an example, what do you guys think this value right here could represent?